Hello, this is Robert Rickover at Body Learning, and today my guest is David Gorman, who's an Alexander Technique teacher in Toronto, Canada. David has been an Alexander teacher for about 30 years, and in the last few years of that time, he has changed the emphasis of his work and has created a process known as learning methods. And we're going to be talking to David today about that process and how it relates to the Alexander technique. So, David, welcome to the program.
Hi, Robert. Thanks for having me on.
And it's great having you. And could you begin by just providing a brief description of the Alexander technique and say a little how that then morphed in your work into learning methods?
Yeah, okay. Well, the technique is notoriously difficult to describe, especially to people that don't know it. So it's probably easiest to kind of talk a little bit about, I suppose, almost what it would be that for someone who first comes to it, and in a sense what our own experiences were as we came to it. So I had lessons initially. A friend of mine turned me on to the only teacher in Canada at that time. This was the early 1970s, a man named Nehemiah Cohen.
Mm-hmm. Who was also my first Alexander teacher.
And luckily enough, he was there. It was in a nearby city, and I had to drive to get there. But after that first lesson, I kind of went because I'd been studying anatomy and doing dissections, and I had been doing that largely to work out how we were built and how we moved for my artwork. I was an artist, but also to work out some things about myself. And after that first session where he stood me up and sat me down in chairs and did a few little movement things and with hands on, and I didn't really understand what he was doing, but I came out at the end of the half hour, I think it was, just feeling that sort of classic cliche of the Alexander work of so incredibly light and whole and free, like I was walking about half a foot off the ground. And I just thought, oh, I don't know what he did there, but whatever it is, that's what I was looking for. So I started to study quite regularly, and I began to find that it was just profoundly changing my life, literally. Not just physically. There were big changes physically. I'd had asthma when I was a kid, and I had a lot of kind of hunched in posture, and that changed, and bones changed relationships. So I found, oh, this is quite dramatic. But the biggest thing was that seeing just how deeply these changes, the way in the Alexander world, there's this concept of the use of oneself, the way that you use yourself in everything that you do, that generally is so much in everything that you do that we're hardly aware of it as anything other than just being me. And so it takes some situation like lessons like this to bring that change of your use in a way so you have something to contrast it and see just how dramatically different one can be functioning. But the thing that just blew me away after the first number of lessons was not just the physical changes, but how profoundly it was affecting my cognition, my point of view on the world, just the way I was seeing things, including the way I perceived myself. And, we'd all heard, of course, about body, mind, and how everything affects everything else, but to experience it in such a deep fashion was to me truly life-changing. So I got very, very interested in the work, and I studied with him ongoingly for a number of years, and just began as I read Alexander's books and tried to figure out, partly from my anatomical knowledge point of view, what was going on, but also out of my own just kind of evolving experiences, what on earth was this very intriguing work that seemed to deepen and get more and more profound as time went on. And I think, there's a number, of course, of principles that are part of it that Alexander discovered, or if not was uniquely the discoverer, certainly articulated it all together in a very clear way at the time when he discovered all this 100 years or so ago. But one of the biggest ones is this territory of that use of oneself that we somehow get ourselves into through whatever factors in our culture, in our life, our boredom at school, our imitating people, our trying to show off our best sides, or be caught up in our shyness, and all the postural, but also kind of cognitive ways that we get locked into being a kind of I guess sort of a personality almost, because it's almost how you end up. Your use is not just a physical way you stand or move. It's your whole way of operating in the world.
Right, and just to break in for a second, I believe that was possibly Alexander's greatest discovery, or certainly one of them, that we tend to have a pattern of doing things that cuts across many, if not all, of the activities we do. And that's what he identified as our use of ourselves, how we do whatever we do.
Yeah. And then he articulated and worked out over years, successfully and somewhat less successfully, but it's a work in progress of how you help somebody become aware of that and change for the better.
Exactly, yeah.
So my point of view going into it, and this sort of now edges a bit more towards the pathway I took, because I had this anatomical interest sort of going into the work. I was always very curious about trying to understand and explain the experiences that happened when I could go in, or somebody could come in to a lesson in a relatively tied up, maybe tense, dysfunctional, in conflict sort of state, and shortly thereafter be in this completely different, very free, very light, very whole, radically changed physical organization. And it didn't seem to me like there was something very, very different that happened that was not really explicable just in the normal anatomical terms of there's bones and muscles, and we're somehow all stacked up in an alignment in posture, and maybe you're doing just a little less work so it feels very light and free. And I began, as soon as I ended up deciding I wanted to train as a teacher, and went to London to train at Walter Carrington's school. Within about a few months after I arrived there, Don Burton, who was a fantastic teacher, who was doing the anatomy lectures at Walter's, he left to begin his own training course. And Walter asked me if I would do the anatomy lectures at the school, because I was the only person that knew anything about anatomy. So I was directly in a place where I needed to be able to articulate not only the anatomy, but connect it to people's experience in training as teachers. And I began to find that I was just not really satisfied with my way of somehow bringing in, if I can put it over here in inverted quotes, the normal anatomical way of saying things with these experiences. Something just didn't match. There always seemed to be something a bit more going on than the normal way of trying to describe it in parts. Mm-hmm. And so I just began to kind of continue to thrash around a bit, rethinking it all, trying to work out how this could make sense. And it was in the course of a number of years of teaching and going back to the books and just really trying to, I decided at one point I would go back and I would really look deeply at the how muscles worked. And I was reading a quite difficult technical book called The Neurophysiology of Postural Mechanisms by T.D.M. Roberts. And there was at one point in there's just one phrase sort of jumped right out at me, and it wasn't really relevant to what I was thinking about, but just the phrase itself grabbed me, and that was They were talking about a dog on a force platform and how if you just move the platform suddenly, the dog kind of, extended its legs out to meet the platform. And it was speaking about this set of up thrusts that went through the dog system. And it was just that word up thrusts that changed it around, because I'd always been thinking, well, there's gravity and gravity goes downwards and we're on the ground and our tendency is to be unstable and fall over. If you can kind of imagine, this tottering biped, as somebody called it, and the muscles being used to kind of control this falling, this sort of downward forces of instability. And I suddenly had an insight that in actual fact you could see it totally the other way around, that there's the earth coming up underneath us, and in a sense, in those up thrusts that go through us, it is the instability itself that puts stretches on the muscles that in fact tones everything up. In other words, it's gravity itself that actually organizes us as a whole creature, as opposed to gravity is the enemy and we're using our muscles to fight against it. So I had this kind of real gestalt of what I began to think of as a suspension system. And it was where I kind of realized that my whole approach to the work was not, here's this work called the Alexander Technique, which I wanted to study and get better at, but rather that here's us, the human beings. And Alexander, of course, had gone, when he had his voice problem, he hadn't gone and studied some work. He'd gone back and looked at himself and how he functioned. Go directly back to nature and see what's going on. And that, in a sense, that was really the job, is to take any of these insights and look at it in terms of the actual function we have, and see if we, regardless of whether we call it the Alexander Technique or any other thing, it's only as valuable as it's an accurate description of what happens in us.
Right.
And so I began to sort of see it more as not learning to get better at the technique, but using this as a way to explore, well, how do we really function? And there was one particular thing. I was a fairly young teacher at that point. I had only been a teacher for a couple of years, I think. And I was finding myself struggling a lot, as most people do in the first years of teaching, still trying to work out, what is this work and how do I do it well, and how to meet this person that comes in with this problem and so on. And I was doing a lot of course, as most of us do, a lot of the things that we were taught. So we're still kind of doing the stuff we did in our training courses. But it suddenly struck me one day that there we were with this other principle that Alexander had come up with about the primary control. That was the kind of that controlling mechanism that controls the functioning of all the rest of us, more or less. The thing that we're basically how humans are built, is the head leads and the body follows. And when there's a freedom of relationship between your head, your sort of functioning you out there in the world, looking and talking and so on, and the rest of you can be in a fairly good functioning coordination. And if that relationship gets interfered with by holding and tension and slumping and so on, it has a whole discoordinating effect through the system. But it sort of really struck me that here I was, paying lip service to this, but still ending up working with people by, working with their arms and their knees and their hips and all these other bits, sort of like tinkering around trying to get the whole system tuned up. And I remember one day just thinking, this is really difficult and really complicated. What if I just really put this work to the test and went and said, well, if this really is the primary control, this freedom of the sort of functional head, the person's awareness in the world around them, and from the rest of them, then what if it just work with that and nothing else, and see if it really does control or coordinate the rest of the system. And so I determined to kind of do that as an experiment with all my students for a while, and sure enough, it was quite remarkable. It really did work.
So what you focused pretty exclusively on their head, neck, upper torso relationship?
Yes, and particularly, and this was also part of my came through part of my study because this hadn't been happening in the training that I'd had. It'd been more working with the head as that physical thing on top of your shoulders there,
Mm-hmm.
and the neck, the actual physical head. But what was becoming clear to me was that the head was a head because of what it did.
Mm-hmm.
That is, it's a head because it's where our attention into the world is and our intention, and we turn, we look, and we talk to people's heads. And in other words, it's not the physical block with the hair on it, it's the functional thing where you um, primarily open up to and interact with the world. So I was kind of working with people's ability to have that awareness into the world, and the activities they were doing have that, which also includes, of course, physically, free from the rest of them. Um, but you're right, yes, the main point was keeping simply rigorously and rather um, systematically just working with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I really did want to put it to the test. I wanted to go, is it just me here why this is so difficult, or have I misunderstood the work or something? And it was the first of a number of times when I went, oh, the real point here is let's put these things to the test and prove them to ourselves. Because I realized for myself is unless I could really prove it to myself, it made no sense for me to be saying it and teaching it to other people if I hadn't put it to that much of the rigorous test.
Mm-hmm.
So that I could stand behind it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that profoundly changed my sense of the work by realizing it really was that a primary organizer of the coordination through the rest of your system. That kind of the head leading, the freedom of your head, your attention, and your intention. But it also became clear to me that it was no good standing there turning your attention away from the world around you into your neck, trying to free your neck, or because that might end up freeing you within yourself, but it tended to make people into sort of strange little Alexander zombies who walked around looking quite out of connection with the world around them.
Mm-hmm. Right. The
Um,
Alexandroid look.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um,
So it's just to clarify for our listeners, it sounds like you were sort of moving in the direction of going beyond the head as just a physical entity, but taking a look at what it actually does in terms of sense organs and relating to the environment around you.
yes, much more the functional
Right.
use as in function rather than use as in structure.
Right. Okay.
And
Great.
this kind of led to another thing that had been sitting there kind of on the periphery of my attention for a while, but this rather focused it, was the whole thing that we often say, if you stop the wrong thing, the right thing will do itself.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the whole experience that happens when you do have these changes, when you free up that whole head leading, body following, is that you do come to a whole sense of a wholeness and a unity within oneself, but also in relation to the world around. It just really struck me that there was a fundamental question here, which is that do we actually have a system which is innately whole and integrated, except to the degree that we've interfered with that, which is quite a different situation than the alternative, which is that we have a system which has evolved up over time and has some parts that don't work so well, and there might be some problems that are not so integrated in our system, and that's why we have all the difficulties. For instance, a lot of the anatomy and physiology and kinesiology books say that we came upright as humans relatively quickly, evolutionarily speaking, and the whole lower back hip area has not evolved sufficiently. That's why people have so many back problems.
Right. And I think again for our listeners, the Alexander technique, I guess the sort of standard Alexander technique approach would be the first of those two that you mentioned that were basically nicely wired up, but for the most part, but then we have learned to interfere with that, and the job of the Alexander technique teacher is to help you become aware of those interferences and learn to release them. Would that be a fair statement of that
Certainly, I
approach?
think what most people would say, and me too. But then we get to if you just spend a moment with those two differences, in the one, if we really are innately whole and integrated, then of course the job at hand, if we do have problems, if we're assuming those are interferences, is to find those interferences and get rid of them,
Mm-hmm.
stop doing them, and then you would find that the inherent wholeness reasserted itself.
Right. Uh-huh.
That would in effect be the proof of that we are in fact built that way.
Mm-hmm.
The other one would be assuming that there is some problem, and we will have problems because we're, let's say, somewhat flawed or somewhat incompletely evolved, and therefore we are going to have to do something new and get good at it and probably keep on doing it in order to not have problems.
Mm-hmm.
And what I began to see in my work and around me, because I was at that point doing a lot of teaching and a lot of other Alexander training courses, partly because of my anatomy knowledge and so on, was that there was really a mix of both. People weren't really clear about this, and I wasn't until I decided to really put this one to the test also. People would be saying we are whole and we just need to stop the interference, but then they'd be getting people to do these ongoing directions, the idea being if you don't do this, it won't work.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, I decided to put that one really to the test and say, what if I stopped all the things that I could say are things that I would be doing to get things working better, trying to free this, trying to think of lengthening, and instead just looked more at, well, what might I be doing that in fact might be bringing about a tightening or a shortening or a problem, and see if I could change that, would my system change of its own? Because there's a huge implication in these two different possibilities. That second one, that we have some sort of flaw and we now need to learn a kind of an ongoing conscious controlling of ourselves. That one means you're going to have to keep on doing that one probably for the rest of your life and hopefully get better and better at it. The implication of that first one is that once you get the interferences out of the way, you're done. You're finished. You now have good use, and you don't have to keep on doing something, unless some sort of interference creeps in again.
I think it might be helpful to really clarify that distinction. Would it be possible for you to give a specific example that would show the two possible approaches in a specific way?
Yeah, I can give you two. I'll give you one kind of, this comes from a little bit later as I began to see all the ways that people ended up interfering, which of course weren't just physical things. So maybe I'll just give a little background on that one, because as I began to explore this, then it sort of became clearer to me. This was now, some maybe 10 years into or 6 or 7 years into my teaching career, back in the mid 80s or so, mid to 85, 86, 87, somewhere around there. Anyway, I began to see that people would come for lessons, and I would put my hands on them, and we would do our various things, including me helping them see how they were straining or reaching out ahead of themselves when they picked things up, and so on. And they would be much freer, and they would go away, and they would come back next week all tangled up again. And I went, yeah, this is what happens. It takes a while to learn this work. But then it just began to kind of come up as a question for me. Well, is it because it takes a while to learn the work, or is it because they're going back out there and getting into things that are actually taking them away from that centered, present, whole state? And I just realized that, I had no idea what people did the rest of the week before they came back to me. My job was to sort of get them during the lesson something and hope they took some of that out and used it during the week. But I began to realize what I'd been basically doing was saying, well, here's the technique. Now start to do this in a new way than you were doing before, instead of kind of seeing, well, hang on, what were you already doing before you came in here that was getting you so caught up? Because the implication, of course, of this, if we are innately whole, except to the degree that we interfere, is that the point is to find the interferences. And this all kind of came to a head one day when I was working with somebody in standing beside the mirror, as we often do. And I said to the person, were you aware that you pulled your head back when you stood up? And he said, no, I didn't. Very, very, very strongly. And I said, well, I can show you in the mirror here. If we do it again, I can show you that it happened. And he said, well, I'm sure it happened, but I didn't do it. And, it suddenly struck me that he was absolutely right. He didn't do it. He wasn't in any question doubting the fact that it may well have happened. But what totally struck me at that point was that he was right. He didn't do it. But normally I would have gotten very busy then showing him that it was happening and trying to get him to be aware of it, that it was an unconscious habit pattern and that he could then inhibit that and so on. But it suddenly struck me that he was absolutely right. He didn't do it. But if he wasn't doing it and it was happening, what was he doing? Because maybe if he was up to something, actually in the way he was going about things that he was conscious of, that went along with the fact that his head pulled back and this whole interference happened through his whole system. So I thought, well, I don't know what people are doing when I, the teacher, would see what I would call misuses. What are people up to? Is it just normal movement? Is it? So anyway, I decided I was going to find out, and I began a process over a number of months with students that were willing to play with it, of just kind of stopping them whenever I saw this misuse happen and asking them, so where are you now and what are you up to? And it was a little awkward and often people didn't know, but eventually it became clear to me that in those kind of movements, generally the person was quite out ahead of themselves. What they would just say, well, I'm just standing up. And I'd find out from them, well, where are you? And they'd already be almost in their attention, almost up to standing before they even got off the chair. Or they'd be sitting down and their attention would be way behind them, halfway to the chair before they'd barely begun to move. And that when they, in essence, got ahead of themselves that way, there was this kind of whole reaching out motion of the body. And what I was seeing, in fact, was not an unconscious habit pattern of the head pulling back. It was a balance reaction of someone trying to get out of the chair before they were over their feet. And so I began to play around a lot, and I just began to see these as people just simply hadn't really understood how movement in space happens. But it led on from that. That was really just finding out what people are up to right in that moment, in the teaching room, in their movements. But then it occurred to me, well, but it's not in the teaching room that's important, it's what they're doing out there in work. And I had another experience once where I was working with somebody and we were just standing for a while and I had my hands on, and we were just getting him to, not react and take a moment here. And as one often does, there's not a lot happening with hands because you're not manipulating somebody, trying to fix things. And he just said to me, he said, gee, I just realized that in the last 20 minutes since I've come in here, I was so rushing and busy and stressed and tense, and I've just calmed down and opened out, and now I feel just so much more present. And he said, I just realized how much ahead of myself I am all the time, way out ahead of myself, trying to do 5 things more than I can do. And it struck me right at the time, well, he was actually describing to me what he's doing all day long, and that his functioning that he gets after doing that for part of the day, getting worse and worse as the day goes on, is that he ends up getting more and more tense and stressed. In other words, that the tension is the coordination of him rushing and trying to do so much, being out ahead of himself, and isn't really something that we need to spend time teaching him how to release tension, because that was just coming back. He would go back out and do the same rushing. In fact, he was actually coming to me hoping to get rid of the tension so he could do even more things.
So he could keep rushing without tension.
Yeah.
So it sounds to me like what you've identified is that for many people, they're not actually present with themselves in the present moment. And
this was the first of those where I really saw, well, that's what the person is up to out there, and of course they have all kinds of ideas that reinforce it. It's
right,
good to get lots of stuff done. The
right,
boss says, "Can you have this by 4:30?" And so everything reinforces it. But the person and myself up to that moment weren't really seeing that when you, the person, go about that, this is how you end up getting coordinated.
right. And if a person is not actually present with themselves at the moment, then telling them to talk to their necks and not tense it might not be that effective because a whole period of time has gone by when they're not even present, and some of the damage has been done. They haven't really brought that thought to bear on themselves in the moment.
Yeah,
Is that the basic problem that you discovered, that there's
well,
this?
for this particular habit, yes, that
Right.
somebody, in effect, I would be asking them to pay more attention, be present enough to release tension or free up that relationship, and of course that would sort of work kind of for a few minutes, but then they would immediately get back into more rushing, and of course get all tangled up again, and then so in effect they were continually trying to undo what they were continually doing to themselves. So it became clear to me, and I just thought, well, okay, so maybe it's the whole way the person is going about things, and the tension simply is the coordination of them rushing like that. So I would then spend the lesson time helping somebody go, how could you go out there and make an experiment and see, what if you went to work tomorrow and you just decided you're not going to rush? You're just going to do things at the speed you can do them, take the time you can take with them, and see, you might get less done, you might get the same amount done, you won't know, but and the point of it is not to get it right. The point is to see, is that's what's causing my tension?
Mm-hmm.
And sure enough, it was a bit of a challenge, but people could do it, especially when we set it up as an experiment, not something to do for the rest of your life, but just something to try for one day, just to see as much as you can. And sure enough, of course, people that managed it came and back and said, well, I just didn't get tense. In fact, I was more present. I actually did a better job in what I did because I was actually not trying to juggle three things at once and getting myself all caught up in conniptions and, unable to see what I was doing. And I got pretty much as much done, and I had no tension and nothing to unwind at the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
So this was really the start of the learning methods, when I began to see that it was not, as it were, a set of unconscious habit patterns of what I would now call somebody's functioning, but more literally the use of themselves, what the self was actually up to, not, pardon me, what the body was up to. That, in other words, the body functioning, the tension or so on, is simply the coordination of the human being having been up to that rushing. And of course that rushing and out ahead of itself is only one pattern of quite a few different ones, although it's a very, very common one these days for a lot of people, given the culture and the pressures on people and so on. But
So just to elaborate on that one example, that one sort of example, the rushing pattern, which of course I think most Alexander Technique teachers see in their teaching practice. You have people coming, their cell phone is ringing, they're rushing to the lesson, then they have to rush off somewhere right after. It sounds to me a little like what you're saying is maybe a bit of a limitation in your view of traditional let's say, Alexander technique teaching pedagogy, that it may contain within it a bit of an assumption that's not always correct, and the assumption being that the person is actually there at the moment, and if you give them some useful things to think about, they can think about them in the moment. But if the person's pattern is to be way ahead of themselves or way behind themselves mentally, then that teaching method's probably not going to work as well. Could that be another way of saying what you've just described?
Yeah, and in effect, the way I see it now is that if somebody hasn't found out really what they are doing, and I'll give you another example in a moment,
Mm-hmm.
then of course they're still going to be doing that, and they're still going to be getting the physical coordination of that, like the rushing person got tense.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, they're going to have to find some way, because they're not seeing the connection. They're going to want to get rid of the tension and do some sort of actual direct, as it were, talking to their body, free this, release this. But it's never going to stay, because they're going to turn around and do the same thing that they were doing before and bring it all back again. And so they will, in fact, be ending up releasing tension kind of forever. And I'll give you another example, because there's other patterns in that one.
Right.
I work with a lot of performers, musicians and actors and dancers, and primarily musicians. But so there's another huge habit pattern that people have developed over time with that, largely again because of their pedagogy, is that it's extremely important to get everything right, to play really well, to hopefully even to be perfect. And consequently, there's a lot of fear around not being perfect. But there's a lot of people going into it going, I have to play well. And so they're putting an undue amount of attention on trying to get all the notes right and so on, and then wondering why they get so tense and caught up. And so if that idea they have that I have to play well, especially with that kind of imperative have to, or it'll be bad, still stays there, then they will end up still getting themselves in trouble. But if they're not aware of that and they're not able to change that idea, and they do get in trouble, they do get tension or sometimes even repetitive strain things, of course they're going to want to try to release those. But now they've got two jobs. They've got the music and the trying to get it right, and then they've got the releasing their shoulder or their bowing arm or their soft palate or their breathing, or so they've added another job on top of the other ones, which is one of the reasons why it will never work.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're looking at it as, how might I be interfering?
Mm-hmm.
And what if I stopped doing that? Would everything actually work better? And so when we can look closely and see, well, what are people doing? Well, there they are doing something that they would call, trying to get it right or doing it well. Something that, in fact, everybody's had experiences of not doing at some times. Let's say that gig last week when we weren't being paid, and there were no critics in the audience, so I just had fun with it. I didn't care.
Mm-hmm.
And no tension, nothing, no problems at all, because they weren't trying to get it right or play well, which often means trying to play better than they can play. Then a week later, they've got a gig at Wigmore Hall with 3 critics in the audience from the big newspapers, and suddenly now they're going, I have to play well, and they're getting all this tension coming back and, wondering why.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a sense now I see my job is to help them uncover what they're actually up to, these often more sets of ideas and approach to things, and then correlating that with the physical effects of it. If I go into it and I try to play well, sounds like a good thing,
Mm-hmm.
but what I get is actually not a good thing at all. I get the tension, I get the strain, whatever I get, and going, could it be that the tension and strain or physical problem I get is the coordination of me doing this supposedly good thing called trying to play well?
So if you were working with a musician around that issue, then you would work with that whole intent on their part about trying to play well. You might ask them to let go of that for a period of time, and would that be the sort of thing you would do?
let's make an experiment. What if you went at it now and just didn't try to play well, just played it. Just let it happen the
Right.
way it
Right.
happens, even if it's not going to be quote
Right.
unquote well.
Right.
And it's a big challenge for people, but by the time they do it, of course, they discover everything is much freer. They're actually playing much better, oddly enough. And they know
Mm-hmm.
this but they've just never sat down and
Mm-hmm.
looked at their experience and looked at their ideas and looked at what comes out of it and put it all together
Mm-hmm.
and understood it.
Yeah, I think that probably most Alexander teachers who have worked with musicians in particular, but other performers as well, have come up against that. My strategy is usually to tell them, hey, this is not a master class. I'm not a music critic. Let go of any interest in trying to perform well for a little period of time. We're going to trust that you actually know the material and know how to play, and that you could more usefully put some of your attention on organizing yourself.
Well, this, the point I'm getting at here with this is, again, this was a part of initially my experiment of my investigation to say, well, do we have to organize ourselves? Or, in fact, if we stop the interference,
Oh, maybe we don't even need to think about freeing your neck if you stop trying to be perfect. Is that,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. In effect, the real
Mm-hmm.
question was, why would you have a neck that wasn't free in the first place? Now,
Mm-hmm.
could it be that it was because of these ideas of going in trying to play well, and whatever the other ones are that, in effect, then constitute the interferences?
Mm-hmm.
The-
Mm-hmm. So there might be a situation where you could work with a musician. You could get them to let go of the intent to play perfectly, but they might still have some neck tension or arm tension or shoulder tension that relates to something else, and then presumably you would work with them on that.
Well, yeah. I mean, my main point is, as this began to be clearer to me as an actual approach,
Mm-hmm.
um, it had a radical shift in the place where the I suppose the learning was coming from. Before it was me, I was the expert. I was the one that knew the Alexander technique. I was the one that could see the misuse in somebody when they couldn't even see it themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the one that had to teach them what to do with this when they didn't know. But this sort of turns it around, because really going, they're the expert. They are the only ones that know what they're up to out there in daily life. They're the only ones that have the experience of what happens to them, and they're the only ones that know what they're thinking. They, the difficulty, of course, is that they don't know how to gather that information and how to be very clear about it. So they keep on doing these things, rushing every day, let's say, and getting tense every day, and they're not able to put it together. So, in a sense, I was seeing it as my job is not to be, showing somebody something that they didn't see, but saying, well, what do you already notice? What symptoms do you notice, and how can we investigate those and see if we can find out, what you might be up to and how you might be going about things when you get those symptoms, to understand how it works. And so, of course, as we do that, things like the musician or the person rushing, you do start to get people understanding how it works. And of course, once you know how things work, you wouldn't think of rushing anymore, because you already know it's going to be bad. It's not a good thing, it's a bad thing. But the main point for me is not to sort of, again, be the expert that helps people solve these issues. It's more to teach them how to do that for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
How to be able to take their own wake-up call of their own symptom and be able to sit down and investigate through, what am I really up to when this is happening, and so that they can then sort that out on their own without someone else having to be there. So that, now I tell you just something interesting when you mentioned, here's what a lot of Alexander teachers are aware of. And at the point when I was doing this was around the time when I started running my own training course, and was discovering a lot of this and bringing it in. And to me, it only seemed to be really more directly getting to the heart of what the Alexander technique was. In fact, if anything, it took it to be really much more of a psychophysical unity, a whole unity where it wasn't I free my body and I find my mind change. It's, or vice versa. It was seeing, well, here's people, here's what you are up to, rushing all day. Here's the actual coordination of that. Notice when you change what you're up to, boom, everything changes. That's really a unity of function, and we've moved it from the use of the self is not the tight neck or the free neck, which I now think of as more the use of the body, if you like, or the functioning. We're literally talking about what the self is doing, the actual person.
So, but and so what? Just coming back to sort of more traditional Alexander technique ideas, when and how would a person decide if they studied with you with the learning methods approach? Is it possible at some point they might discover that even when they're not rushing, there's something that they would like to work on that is a more, I guess for want of a better word, a more classical Alexander technique instruction?
Well, I think there's still a huge role for that, because out of the end of this, and especially as I then about 9 or 10 years later wound up my training course and stopped training people because I was moving from London. I moved to the south of France. I decided to really kind of make another big experiment, which was just how far would this sort of learning methods approach go? Would it solve all the normal kind of use problems with people, or would there still be stuff left over? Because I didn't know, because I hadn't done it, that rigorously.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided, because I had one experience with, our work in the training course had changed so much that we weren't really using hands-on to give people new experiences, especially not new experiences of freedom and everything. We were more using hands-on there to get people to stop all the trying, including trying to change their system, and just be right where they are as they were right in that moment without trying to change a single thing. Even if they didn't like the way they were feeling at the moment, they were still going to willingly give permission to, to be just at the moment they are without changing anything. And interestingly enough, of course, that was such a huge change for most people and had huge physical changes, because there was no longer a person there who was judging that something was wrong in their system and needed fixing, and then trying to go about trying to fix it by releasing or getting the teacher to do it and hopefully getting to a better place a moment later. Instead, there was just somebody there saying, well, I'm already here, and I'm going to be the whole me. And so you get a person making a choice to, in a sense, already live a wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
And once the person stops that huge end-gaining thing of, I don't like where I am now, I want to get somewhere better a moment later, of course, there's no longer a person doing any trying, and so people end up in the state after a few minutes of what it feels like to not be trying anything. And of course, it's much freer and much more whole and much more present. And there was a huge insight I had at one point there that about this, another one of these big, and I think really, really central premises of the Alexander work, the so-called unreliable sensory appreciation. That at one point Alexander said somewhere, and I think I'm paraphrasing, but if you don't have reliable sensory appreciation, you don't have a hope of having good use.
Mm-hmm. And by that he meant, just again for our audience, that if we don't have accurate information about how we're standing or how we're moving, then our standing and movement is based on faulty information, and the result will be, as he would call it, misuse patterns.
Yeah,
Harmful tensions of various kinds.
And because what certainly happens when we get into poor habits is your perception of yourself gets distorted enough that people don't even know that they're caught up. They don't know that they're not straight. They don't know, and they're in a sense, you have an unreliable appreciation or
Right.
interpretation
Right.
of the sensory. But I'd always been sort of taught that the the implication was more that the senses are unreliable, so don't use your feelings because they won't tell you what's happening. But then I began to realize it's not really that at all. There's a huge amount of important information. We're just interpreting it inaccurately. And that once people learn to interpret it more accurately, I'll give an example that anybody that's had, any kind of normal Alexander lessons probably feels, is that difference between standing up, say from sitting to standing and going, I'm doing a certain amount of work to push myself up. My legs have to tighten, and their interpretation of that is that there's gravity and I have weight and it takes work to stand up. And it seems to make perfect sense because it seems like a reality. Then they have some of the lesson and they find themselves standing up with no effort at all. And you go, this is bizarre. How could this happen? Gravity didn't change. I didn't lose weight, but I'm having a completely different experience and that effort isn't there. So in effect, the unreliable appreciation of that first experience is that that's gravity and that's weight and it takes effort to stand up against weight. In effect, that the effort is what's getting you up. Mm-hmm. But if the teacher, especially, of course, if the teacher understands this and takes the time to articulate it and get it across to their student, they'll be helping them see that it wasn't just because you had good use you got up. They'll be going, that time you stood up, obviously muscles are working, but you're not feeling them in the same way because we don't feel the normal work of stuff. We only feel what we normally call effort is in fact the work of working against yourself. Mm-hmm. In other words, you stood up without that effort, therefore that effort was not getting you up, that effort was making it harder to get up. It was in fact the working against oneself. Mm-hmm. And that's a reliable appreciation of that experience, which of course once people perceive that and then they perceive effort, they'll know that, okay, I'm going about this in some funny way here because I'm feeling effort, I'm feeling working against myself.
And the idea then is that the student can take that out on their own, and when they notice effort on their own, that would cause them to perhaps reevaluate what they're up to.
Well, it's like a message from the system saying,
right.
Okay, hang on, wake up, something's going on here, there's some sort of strain happening, some sort of effort.
Right.
Can you now understand and look at what you're doing enough to sort it out? Mm-hmm. But let me just get back to this part. I was kind of halfway through the bit about this big experiment and it originally came up in the training course, as I was saying, when we were working in that particular way of not trying to change, not trying to give people more freedom and everything, but just getting them to stop all the things they were normally doing and just, be here in this space for a while without trying anything and then discover how much they changed, which of course would tend to give them the understanding that they were getting so caught up and tense by doing all that stuff out in the world.
Right.
If they could go about just more being just where they are, as they are, everything would be a lot freer. But at one point I just thought, I wonder how far this goes here. What if we had somebody that came in with very poor use, but we didn't try to fix all that use, and just over the course of the 3 years of the training, the way we were working was basically that. And so I chose one person who came in who was very shy and very kind of low self-esteem and very hunched in. And I thought, this is going to be my test case to see over 3 years in this training where we were definitely not, trying to fix people up and correct their posture and change them at all, letting them just be where they are, as they are. And that person just changed so much over those 3 years, the sort of stuff that I would have been after by trying to do all the, help them become aware that they were slouched and slumped and try to direct this and free this and get good physical use. We didn't do any of that. But by the time she began to see that, she could just be herself in this moment, she could allow that even though she thought she was worthless and useless, but she could do it. And then she began to see, well, as she did it, she actually was still here and she could have ideas and she could say them and people did see them, and she actually was able to think, and she it was okay being herself. And you can imagine the sort of personal transformation that happened when somebody begins to really let themselves be themselves and sees that that's actually okay, and that other people are seeing her, and so she had this remarkable personal transformation which actually changed her whole physical use in the way that most Alexander people would say. So she was so up and outgoing, and at the end of that, and so I decided, as I finished the training, that I needed to do a big experiment, which was to stop all the normal kind of Alexander stuff where I would in any way attempt to show somebody something about their use that they didn't see, and instead just go at it from this learning methods point of view and see, does that cover everything and that their use will change, or does it still leave some things undone? I didn't know, so I had to make this experiment. So it must have been at least 5 or 6 years of totally dropping that one way of working so I could just do this and see, what does happen to people. Of course, a lot of people that did come in, my old Alexander eyes saw them with, oh God, look at that slump, or look at that tightness, or look at that pullback, or, in a way I really wanted to get in there and change it, but I didn't.
Mm-hmm.
And instead we would get at what's going on in their life. They're trying to be better, their relationship conflicts, whatever it is that they noticed that was happening, and gradually solving one after the other until they could basically say, okay, I'm pretty much, I don't have any problems anymore. And of course most of them changed so hugely that I would have been more than happy to have that change come out, out of a normal Alexander teaching. But I did begin to notice after a number of years that there were still some persistent, is probably the best way to put it, sort of physical functioning kind of things that they were unaware of, that I could see were still potentially giving them little bits of problems, though the major life problems they had were gone. And their lives were much better, and they weren't really complaining about it, except sometimes there were a few symptoms that we just couldn't find some reason for. But I could kind of see, I bet it has something to do with that whole way that they're moving. So I did begin to see that there is, in fact, the territory of outside of all the things that you can get at when you do help people look at what am I actually doing during my day. There is still a degree of kind of, for lack of a better term, unconscious habit pattern that we can get in and help people with our hands or with a mirror to begin to be a bit more aware of. And so I've begun in the last number of years seeing how I can integrate a bit of that in when it seems appropriate to people. It feels to me kind of like coming back to the technique, but from a very different place. Because the one thing that I was seeing so powerfully when I began to change the work, that I think is a big problem in the normal way of working, if anybody, put it this way, is putting their hands on, a teacher is putting their hands on to bring about some fairly changed experience that the student doesn't know where it came from. The tendency is, of course, the student has this wonderful new experience that they don't know where it came from, and they don't know what they were doing normally to cause the problems, to get themselves in their normal state. So they just have this new experience, and of course they all want to get it back, even though we tell them, you don't try to keep it and don't try to get it back. Right. They all do.
Right.
And so it becomes this big seduction that, for me as the teacher, we have to spend a fair amount of time trying to get people out of it, even though it was us that put them in it in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I've spent a fair bit of time in the last number of years developing ways that I can get people sort of to bring about changes in these ways of functioning that they're not so aware of, but without me doing it directly with my hands. So I can circumvent that trap of people, getting so seduced by the changed experience. That's what they think they're after. They're literally end-gaining for a feeling of a change and not really understanding. So the upshot is often reminds me of that old psychology or biology experiment where they put the wires in the rats' brains in the pleasure center, and all the rats wanted to do was sit and press the pedal and feel good all day long.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's people tend to take it that way, even though we know that's not what it's about, but it could be a lot of work to get them out of that.
Right.
And one can certainly understand why people would, kind of take it that way.
Okay. I think that we're kind of coming up towards the end of our conversation, just in terms of time limits. Is there anything else that you want to add fairly briefly, or what?
Well, I can say a couple of things. Just, around the learning methods territory, if people do want to explore a bit more of what that is, they can go to my website, LearningMethods.com. Learning Methods, all one word with an S on the end.
And we'll be putting a link to that next to the interview also.
And there's plenty of stuff up there, including lots of articles that, I don't have to get into that here. You can explore it there.
Right. And you have trained people to do this work, right?
Yes, there's a number of teachers who have trained, who are out there teaching themselves and teaching in universities or conservatories. And
So if having listened to this talk, if the ideas that David has been talking about make sense to you, or if you'd like to explore it further, definitely visit his site. He does have a wealth of information there, and then locate a teacher in your area. And I believe you do workshops in different locations as well. Is that right?
Yeah, there's links there to the various teachers. There's some in the States around Minneapolis. There's some in Europe and Sweden.
But there are workshops that someone could go to also, right?
And there's a link there to workshops and so on. Yeah. There's also a number of articles and books and recordings and things people can buy too, or download ebooks. But there's another thing, sort of apropos more of these kind of podcasts and everything, that maybe we can do. I'll just put it out as a suggestion. If I felt like doing another one, I could get into a little bit of some of that territory of what I have been developing that can help show people their a lot of the misuse sort of things that they're unaware of, and the ways of getting at that hopefully, as much as possible, circumvent the kind of trap of people just getting in there trying to fix themselves up.
So some practical suggestions and exercises, is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah, I mean, we could, if you felt like doing it.
Why don't we plan that as a follow-up podcast?
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Well, David, thank you so much for being on the show today. My guest has been David Gorman, an Alexander Technique teacher and the developer of Learning Methods approach, which builds on Alexander ideas and goes in a slightly different direction, I guess we could say. And David is based in Toronto, Canada, and does workshops at various locations around the world. We'll put a link to his website next to the interview, and then we will set up a second interview where he can actually go through some perhaps guided experiments that you could do. David, thank you so much for being on the show today.
My pleasure, Robert.